All right, welcome everybody to Paleo Talks this week. And we are here in Johnson City, Tennessee, coming to you live from the Center of Excellence in Paleontology from our houses. And the Center of Excellence in Paleontology, if you haven't heard us talk about it before, is part of East Tennessee State University. And we oversee the Gray Fossil Site and its museum. I'm one of the co-hosts of the show today, and we have a special guest and one of my oldest, not oldest in years himself, but oldest friends in paleontology, Dr. Chris Jass. And so we're going to have him in just a minute talking about Ice Age mammals of Alberta. And before we do that, though, David, co-host, is going to tell you a little bit about how the show works. David?
Thanks, Blaine, and hi, everybody. I am the science communicator at the Gray Fossil Site and doing all the techie stuff for these talks. This is going to work the same way as the other ones if you've been watching. Blaine's going to lead our guest through discussing the topic at hand, ask some questions, prompt sharing of some images and information. And then about halfway through, so about 20 minutes in or so, we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. So this video is being streamed live to YouTube. So if you're on the YouTube video, you can go into the live chat on the side and ask your question there. Once we start taking them, we'll read them out for our guest to answer. If you're for some reason having trouble with the YouTube chat, feel free to go on our Facebook or on our Twitter, send us a message. I'll try to keep an eye on those as well.
All right, thank you, David. So once again, this is Paleo Talks, and today we have Dr. Chris Jass, who is way up in Canada now, but he and I met many years ago. And if, David, if you wouldn't mind sort of going over now and showing Chris, he can be highlighted. Maybe he could start by telling us a little bit more about himself and where he's at.
So I'm actually sitting at the Royal Alberta Museum. I am one of the few people probably who hasn't been working from home during the COVID shutdown. The back of the house at the museum has been open. I'm the curator of Quaternary or Ice Age paleontology here at the museum, and I've been here since 2008. Moved up here in 2008. So.
When did we meet, Chris? How many years ago?
We met, I want to say 1991, I think it was. I was a natural history interpreter at the Mammoth site in South Dakota, and Blaine was a young budding graduate student getting ready to start at Northern Arizona University. And
I'm sorry to put you on the spot. It was 1994. I did check.
So, was it 94?
It was, because I was just starting the program, and I was driving out, and then I went to the site to meet with Jim, and I met you on that route. And then I started that fall in 1994, same year I graduated. And then I think it was 95 that you were there too, and then you started in, did you start in 96 or 95?
At NAU? I started in 95.
Yeah.
So I started
that's
in
right.
95.
You started in 95, but we had met again that summer.
Right, because you came up as a crew chief. You came up as a crew
in
chief.
95. That's right. Yeah.
Long time, good God.
Long time ago. So we were in the Quaternary Studies program when it still existed at Northern Arizona University. Yeah. Wow. So you are now a Quaternary curator. Now, I don't know how many Quaternary curators there are out there.
Yeah, I don't know. I have to admit, when I finished up my PhD and was looking for jobs, and I saw the job posting here, I have to admit that if I'd sat down and wrote the perfect job description for myself, it wouldn't have looked much different than the one that was posted for this position. And I think I had a phone call that they wanted me to come for an interview on the day that I handed in the final copy of my dissertation. So that was a pretty good day.
Yeah. And you guys just finished sort of redoing your whole museum up there in location and new exhibits.
We did. So we moved from the old location, which was not in the downtown. It was to the west of downtown Edmonton. And we've moved to a brand new building in the heart of the downtown We've got probably double the gallery space, natural history gallery, human history gallery, a bug room, a children's gallery, and a feature gallery. So a much bigger space, and in an area that I think there's a lot more traffic. So obviously COVID has impacted all museums and all institutions, but we've just opened back up, and we've got timed entries, so people can come to the museum, but they're sort of staggering, you know, the number of people who are in the building at any one time. So yeah, and that was an adventure, moving all of the collections and, you know, contributing to the exhibits in a totally new space. Not something that many of us get to do. So it was a challenging experience, but a very cool experience to be part of.
I'm sure it was headache free, no headaches and any of that.
None.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and start talking about Alberta, Chris, and the work that you're doing up there. If you can share your first slide.
Sure. Do I need to click share screen here? Is that what I need to do?
You do.
Okay.
And you're in control now.
Okay, so is that working? You guys can see?
That's perfect.
Can you see my cursor or not?
I don't see your cursor right now.
Okay, so I'll just sort of, I might have to describe some of the areas that I'm talking about.
Okay.
So if you look to the bottom left of the slide, I always, especially for audiences from the US, I always like to show where Alberta's at. So I think take a look at the lower left there and you'll see Alberta highlighted, and then Edmonton and Calgary are the two big cities in Alberta. The Rocky Mountains form the Canadian Rocky Mountains form the southwestern border of the province, right along the British Columbia border. And then at the bottom, we would be sitting right above Montana, just to sort of orient you as to where we're located. So we are in kind of an interesting area in between, from a quaternary perspective, in that we're between Beringia and most of, you know, mainland North America. Let me go ahead and go to the next slide.
I think that leads into the question that I was going to ask, Chris, and that is about this corridor that we always hear about in the late Pleistocene, and sort of when that corridor was open.
Okay, I will, well, here, I'm going to go to answer that question. I will go to this slide. So this shows you Alberta during the latest Pleistocene. And really in the record here in the province, we're really restricted, and not exclusively, but the majority of the record, I would say, is, you know, roughly the last 100 to 80,000 years or so. And that's in part because of the geologic history of the province. So as Blaine said, there's been a lot of interest in this corridor through Alberta, in part because it's a significant dispersal area for both populations of animals and for humans. So there's been a lot of interest in this region of North America for a long time. Prior to the last glacial maximum, that area from Beringia leading into Alberta and then further to the south in the US would have been open. And you'll see on the left of it should be on the left of your screen, you'll see a map of Alberta in pre-LGM time. The white represents ice.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah.
Can you go back to the earlier one though, because
sure.
it does show better first just the area that you're talking about.
Yeah. So yeah, this more broadly shows you the location of Alberta. Since I can't use the cursor, it would be down towards the bottom part, in between the Cordilleran ice sheet and the Laurentide ice sheet, extending down to the US border there.
Right.
And I'll flip back here. So basically the record in Alberta, the fossil record, Ice Age fossil record in Alberta, is restricted to a couple of big time bins. And one of those we refer to as pre-LGM, so it's prior to the last glacial maximum, so roughly older than 22,000 years ago. And at that time, Alberta would have been open. There wouldn't have been ice here. Animals would have been moving around the landscape. But then roughly 22,000 years ago, you have coalescence of glacial ice. You have ice, the Cordilleran ice sheet coming out of the Canadian Rocky Mountains, and the Laurentide ice sheet coming out of northeastern Canada. And those actually coalesced for a period of time. And that is one of the reasons why I think this is actually a really, really interesting area to work in. It's a pretty interesting natural laboratory in that you don't have a much bigger ecosystem disturbance than moving ice across the landscape like that. Basically, there was nothing living here for roughly 10,000 years. And whether that was because there was ice here or because the proximity of the ice rendered the landscape uninhabitable, that's something that we can discuss and still debate. But basically, the record tells us that there was nothing here for 10,000 years. So how does life come back to a highly disturbed landscape? That's something that the Alberta record can contribute really uniquely to in terms of providing a historical perspective on how animal populations and plant populations respond to major ecosystem disturbances. And in some sense, hopefully over time, that may give us predictive power about how animals and plants in the future will respond to ecosystem disturbance. You will hear me, I'll probably talk, I will in fact talk about pre-LGM time and post-LGM time. And that simply refers to, pre-LGM refers to the time period older than 22,000 years ago. Post-LGM is roughly 12,000 years ago and younger. So the LGM would be the 10,000 year gap in between. And those two broad bins are basically where we can place most fossils that we find from Ice Age deposits here in Alberta. So the record here is interesting and it's challenging. We don't have beds of complete mammoths. We don't have deposits like the Gray Fossil site or like the Mammoth site in Hot Springs, South Dakota. I sort of characterize the record here as being one of bits and pieces. We tend to find bits and pieces of lots of different animals. And most of the Ice Age megafauna record that we have comes from sand and gravel deposits that are associated with major river drainages in the province. So they're remains that are collected from a highly dynamic environment where things are being moved around and reworked all the time. There's lots of fossils, but they tend to be thinly distributed among huge volumes of gravel. So the photograph to the upper right there is a typical gravel pit from along the North Saskatchewan River or near the North Saskatchewan River in Edmonton. And if you look to the far right of that photograph, you'll see a little person standing there for scale. So it should give you some sense of the scale of the gravel deposits. Now, these deposits are not things that, you simply don't just go out and walk the landscape and see those kinds of exposures. The only reason that we're seeing a lot of the fossils that we're seeing is because industry is coming in and putting big blades in the ground and moving lots of material around. So the same sand and gravel deposits that are of interest to industry for building roads or buildings, those are the deposits that are producing Ice Age fossils for us. So we work pretty closely with folks in industry to try to recover fossil material. And you'll see in the photograph to the upper left there, I'm standing with a table full of fossils from a gravel pit in the Edmonton area. And that was material that basically the operator of the gravel pit had his crews set aside for us. When they would see something, they would set it aside for us and save it from going into the crusher, and then we would go pick it up. Mm-hmm. That creates some challenges for us because we don't see the fossils in direct context. We don't see where they're coming from geologically in a lot of cases. So we spend a lot of time and effort and money to try to get direct dates on things that are of interest to us. It's just because of the nature of the record, we're forced to do that. And even if we saw these fossils in context, because they're from a highly dynamic system, we tend to want to get direct dates on them anyway.
Chris, so on one of the earlier episodes, we had Grant Zazula talking about material in the permafrost up in the Yukon. And, you know, that material is exquisitely well preserved, and they're finding it when they're looking for particular minerals or elements. And in this case, how well are these fossils preserved in terms of something like collagen preservation in comparison to those ones from the permafrost? Is it pretty good stuff?
Yeah, we've had really good luck in terms of getting collagen and DNA out of the bones that are coming out of the Edmonton area. The big difference is in I would say the quality of the preservation and the completeness of some of those specimens. Grant gets things like, you know, complete bison priscus skulls. We don't see typically that kind of material. You know, if you look at some of the fossils on that table in the photo in the upper left, you'll see, you know, they're fairly well preserved, but there's a big piece of mammoth tusk there that's basically exploding. Whereas some of the material that you get out of the permafrost, like in terms of tusks, will be beautiful material that you could probably still carve if you wanted to. The material that we get tends to start to splay and explode. And I think that's the difference between being preserved in an environment where you're frozen year round versus going through some of these alternating freeze thaw cycles. So a lot of our material has gone through probably freeze thaw cycles. But in terms of bone collagen, it's very well preserved. We've had really good luck in terms of getting radiocarbon dates and looking at DNA.
So this is massive amounts of glacial outwash and erratics.
Well, some of it is pre-glacial. So it would be pre-glacial deposits that were deeply buried that then weren't impacted as the glacier did move across the province to coalesce. So, okay. We're starting to see some older material. There's some tantalizing evidence that suggests that some of these gravel deposits actually have material that may be significantly older than what we once thought. And some of that information is coming out because of some of the genetic work that's been done recently. And some of that is because we've found a few fossils that don't seem to really fit late Pleistocene fauna in Alberta. So one of the things, was there anything else question-wise there?
Not on this one.
Okay. One of the things that I did want to point out, because we do a lot of work with industry here, the situation with fossils in Alberta is quite different from a lot of the rest of North America, the US in particular. So fossils in Alberta are considered crown property or public property. They're something that belongs to all of us. They're part of a shared heritage that we're all a part of. And so you can't buy or sell fossils that come from Alberta. They technically belong to the Crown. And because of that, when fossils are found at sites like gravel pits, those owners are obliged to get a hold of us and let us know that they found something. I will say that one of the things that gets raised a lot is people are worried that if a fossil is found, that their operation is going to be shut down. And what I tell them is, think about if you got shut down because you told me there was a fossil there, would you ever tell me there was another fossil? Right. So it's kind of counterproductive. So we do have a really sort of proactive program that works with the sand and gravel industry to try to ease concerns that they have, when they do find fossils. And a couple photos at the bottom there are from a gravel pit down near Medicine Hat in southern Alberta. The photo to the left shows an area where a Musk Ox skull was found. And the owner of the pit gave me a call, sent me a photograph, and I said, okay, I'll be down in a couple of days. I came down and he had somebody jump up on the excavator and keep working in that section to see if we could find any more material. We didn't, but that is sort of an ideal way that this process of us working with industry will play out. And then that's actually the photo to the right is the owner of that gravel pit. That's Doug Bauman. And you can see some of the glacial erratics there. So those are rocks that don't really belong in southern Alberta that were transported by glacial ice.
Okay.
So even though there are some challenges to working with those bits and pieces, it's those bits and pieces that actually inform us about what was living on the landscape in the Ice Age in Alberta. So we can take those bits and pieces and reconstruct what we think pre-glacial Edmonton looked like. And the image at the top is a recent piece of artwork that we had done for the museum. If you come and visit the museum, you'll actually see that mural at about 8 to 10 feet high and 30 feet wide. So it's on display in our Ice Age gallery. But that mural is a direct result of us identifying some of those bits and pieces that we find in sand and gravel deposits. So at a basic level, those fossils are informative for us. We do occasionally find a site that has more complete material. And this slide shows you an area of Alberta that we're working in that is one of the post-glacial deposits in the province. And it's one of the few areas where we are finding fairly complete skeletal material. This is the Wally's Beach site in southern Alberta. This site was originally worked by colleagues from the University of Calgary. They did a lot of great work there, and we've just kind of picked up the mantle and are continuing to prospect and collect fossil material from this site. This site is really significant because it includes, it's of interest to both paleontologists and archaeologists. And a third thing, it's got Pleistocene Trackways. So the photo in the upper left corner is a picture of Len Hills, who was a former professor at the University of Calgary, standing next to a series of mammoth tracks. So it's definitely unique for us in that sense. It's a highly dynamic environment in that it's a reservoir site now. So there's a reservoir there. And when the reservoir is drawn down, we can go out and collect fossils and occasionally see trackways. The winds blow heavy and hard in southern Alberta, and they continually expose material when the water levels are drawn down. So this site that we're continuing to work on, and ultimately I sort of see this site as this is one of the last gasps of Ice Age megafauna, certainly in Alberta. And there's a lot of work to be done with the fossil material from this site in a couple of different areas. One, understanding when life came back to the province after the ice receded, but also in terms of looking at how the animals that we find there may have been stressed or responding to environmental changes as we approached the time when things like camels and horses went locally extinct.
Chris, I have some more questions, but I want to open it up to the audience if David has any right now.
Okay.
Sure. So as we move into this next section of the presentation, I'll remind everybody who's watching us live that now we're taking audience questions. So if you are on the YouTube video, you can see the chat on the right-hand side. Go ahead, if you have a question, enter it in there. Like I said previously, if you're having any sort of trouble getting your question to show up in the YouTube chat for some reason, go over to our Gray Fossil Site Facebook page or Twitter account and send us a message there, and I'll be trying to keep an eye on those. We do have a couple of comments. So one comment that I'll make mention of is that our friend Grant Zazula said proteins with lots of exclamation marks. So is there anything you want to say about proteins while we're waiting for the questions to build up?
Well, one of the things that I don't know, well, I'm not entirely sure what Grant is getting at with that. But one of the things that he and I have talked about is looking at using proteins to identify some of the fragmentary or less diagnostic fossil material that we get from the province. Certainly at Wally's Beach, one of the things we do see a lot of fragmentary material that, you know, well, maybe this is a piece of a camel, maybe this is a piece of a horse. One of the areas that we're thinking that material might be useful for is to look at proteins and to help build our sample sizes. If we can use bone proteins to say, yeah, that little fragment is part of a Pleistocene camel, then we can use those specimens to do additional isotopic work or to basically bolster our sample size. And then Grant and I are collaborating on a little project with some other folks, looking at this really odd camel toe bone that we found in the University of Alberta collections from Ice Age deposits in the Edmonton area. It's a giant camel that really doesn't belong in late Pleistocene faunas in Alberta. And it may be more akin to some of the larger camels that Grant's finding up in the Yukon. So I suspect that's where he was going with that.
So we've got a few questions pouring in now. The first one is actually a very general question about paleontology. And this one, Chris, you can certainly offer an answer, and then Blaine might have something he wants to say too. Rue Luna on YouTube says, I'm thinking about paleontology as a career. I'm 23, no college yet. Any advice? And adds that they're 4.5 hours away from ETSU.
Well, I think if you, the thing that I always tell people is if you can't see yourself doing anything else, then this is a good field to go into. If, you know, if you're okay with watching your friends and colleagues buy homes and you're still in graduate school, that's paleontology is a potential career path for you. I think that's the biggest thing. There's not a lot of jobs in paleontology. I don't think any of us would say that there is, but it's a great field, and if you're passionate about it, go for it. And ETSU would be a great place to go. So,
and I would add that it's never really too late, you know, to get into paleontology. If you decide, you know, you're on a different path and you decide you want to try paleontology, it's not too late. Many of us actually ended up going down that track later in life and were sort of non-traditional students ending up in the paleontology field. But I'll add another point to what Chris said, and as a paleontologist who Chris knows well, as Ernie Lindelius once said to me, don't become a paleontologist unless you have to. And I had to think about what that meant. And really what he meant was, you know, you have to be really dedicated to that path. It's going to be a long path if you want to be a professional paleontologist in a research position at a university or at a museum. But there are other jobs along the way. Even with an undergraduate degree or with a master's degree, one could potentially work at a national park, a state park, as a collections manager, and other museum preparator types of positions. And so there are quite a few different options, but there are a lot of people that are also looking for those jobs. So we don't want to try and sell you into something and say you're going to get a job in that. But we love our jobs, and we get to study these things from the past as our job. And it's a great group of people. And so, you know, if it's something you want to get into, I suggest you start contacting paleontologists and try and visit some conferences.
I'll add one thing to Blaine's comment about the sort of non-traditional pathway. I actually have an undergraduate degree in sociology and social science. So I did kind of a big diversion even after getting my undergraduate degree. And as Blaine said, it's because I couldn't really see myself doing anything else. So.
Good question. Hopefully that's helpful. Now we've got some more specific questions. Dennis says, hi from Calgary. Have you found any butcher marks on the mammoth bones?
We have not found butcher marks on the mammoth bones. The Wally's beach site, which is the slide that's still up there, is one that they have found camel bones that have some marks on them that have been interpreted as butcher marks, camel and horse. So we have found some evidence of interactions between people and Ice Age megafauna at the Wally's beach site, or I should say, actually, my colleagues from Calgary were the ones that identified that. And but no, not in Alberta. I can't think of a situation where we have found mammoth bones that have any clear cut marks or butcher marks on them.
All right. We've got a good list of these now. Barbara asks, how similar were those prehistoric camels to the camels we have in the world nowadays? Thinking about all camel, things including llamas, as well as camels that we think of in the Middle East and Asia.
Yeah, I don't think that they would not be drastically different in terms of their morphology. There's enough differences there that we call them something different. But I have to admit that, and this is maybe a bit of a tangent that doesn't necessarily address the question, but one of the things that has always puzzled me with the North American extinctions is that we lost camels. Because you look around North America today and llamas seem to do quite well. So the loss of some of those animals in North America still puzzles me a bit, because they're not all that different from some of the critters that are still kicking around today. Schubert, I don't know if you do you have a comment on that, a thought?
I think it's one of those animals. That's getting some feedback there. One of those animals that's particularly fun to think about here in North America, that it did a good deal of its evolution here. And a lot of people don't connect the fact that the llamas and alpacas of South America are camels, just like the camels that are in the old world. And that at one time they were spread across the continent here. And at times there were certainly ones that would have looked much larger, much different in their overall size, but by and large, they look like camels. Yeah.
All right, we are nearing the length that we typically keep the recordings to. So let's go ahead and do another question. What do you say, one more, Blaine?
Yeah, we can do one more, and then Chris can follow up with anything else that he wants to include in the recording part.
All right, so I'll take this one from Maggie, who asks, what methods did you use to support the lack of life in the corridor within those 10,000 years?
Well, it's sort of a negative evidence argument, in that we have dated hundreds, if not thousands, of specimens and sites in the corridor. And we do not have a radiocarbon date on any critter that falls within that time period from roughly 22,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago. There are no deposits that have fossil material of that age. Now, that's not to say that we might never, that we would never find that. I would love, one of the things that I do is, much like Blaine, I go crawl around caves and I look for fossils. And one of the areas that I'm working in right now is the Canadian Rocky Mountains out in Jasper National Park. And I would love to find a cave deposit out there that has something that falls within that time frame, but we haven't found it yet. So, I mean, it's possible that some of those higher elevation areas were acting as refugia that animal life may have persisted on. But we just have not found any evidence that suggests that there was anything living here within that time frame. So that's not to say we never will, but when given the number of samples that have been evaluated and the number of dates that have been run, to have nothing that falls within that time frame seems to be saying something about what the landscape looked like at that time.
So it's radiocarbon dates on animal bones across the landscape.
Yeah.
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 All right, so we do have a few more comments building up here in the chat, but I think what we'll do, as we've done in the past, is end the recording in the official length of the discussion with some final comments from Chris and Blaine. But if you have asked questions, we'll stick around for a little bit after we officially wrap it up to address some of those.
So Chris, to go back to you, if there's any other points you wanted to make before we stop the recording, anybody you want to thank or anything like that?
Sure. I will just go, I'm going to skip all these other slides that I had prepared. We can go back to those, but
Yes, we will.
but none of this work gets done in isolation, you know, and so a couple people that I have to especially thank, I have pictured here. This is Christina Barron Ortiz to the right and Catherine Bramble to the left. They are part of the team here in the Quaternary Paleontology program at the museum. And I would not be half as productive as I am if not for their help. I'm not sure in this photo if they're actually getting ready to do field work at Wally's Beach or rob a bank, but anyways, you know, none of this work that we do gets done in isolation, and it really is collaborative. So I talk about my work, but it's really generally always a more collaborative effort. So I wanted to emphasize that.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Well, thank you again for being on the show. This was Paleo Talks number 10. So that one's in the books. Thanks again, Chris. And stick around if you want to ask more questions.